How's it going, everybody? Welcome back for another episode of Locally Sourced. I am Carter, your host, and housekeeping out of the way. If you like the channel, you can hit subscribe on YouTube. If you want to support the channel, you can head to Patreon or Substack. Links will be in the description. And support this so that it remains editorially independent and not subservient to anyone else's interests. We're just going for it. But I'm really excited because my guest today is Phil Sletten. He is the research director of New Hampshire Fiscal Policy Institute, and I'm going to bring him on now. Phil, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm good. I'm hanging in there. I can hear you just fine. We're doing great. So
Okay, great.
so you guys do really fantastic work at NHFPI, and what spawned this whole instance of me reaching out to you guys was that the new state budget just came out, and they talk about how they have a surplus. Now, from my perspective, when I read articles that are talking about the state budget and they say they have a surplus, I think about all of the local townspeople that will say, oh, my property taxes are too high, but there's a lack of investment in the schools. At the same time, we're spending too much on the schools, and it sort of gets a little mixed up. And at the same time, I also think about just the general attitude coming out of Concord, which is, well, we want to cut taxes, we want to reduce taxes, and how does that get done? AOT just passed this new cap proposal that has to be on, town ballots, and so I'm just sort of curious as to help viewers who may or have read articles on In-Depth NH, let's say, about the budget. Let's try and demystify that a bit, because when I think about sort of just the overall budget, right, because we can probably start with education, just because the education budget is somewhere between $3.5 to $4 billion every year, right? And a lot of people are very familiar with the concept of downshifting in the state, where we're shifting the burden of those property taxes, which fund education, onto the local taxpayers. But at the same time, that report said that they had pulled over $3 billion for the general and education fund, and so I guess we can start by the direct question of what portion of that money is actually allocated or could potentially be allocated from the state level to education in a way that might provide an opportunity for local property taxes to be alleviated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great question. So stepping back, the most recent data that we just received, right, the data that we received as of the end of June, that is the first, and it's the cash basis, so it's preliminary, but it's the first year of revenue in our 2-year budget. So New Hampshire, the state legislators passed the state budget, the governor signed it back in June of 2025. That budget is in effect from July 1st, 2025 to June 30th, 2027. It's 2 state fiscal years. So in New Hampshire, we have a 2-year budget. 30 states have a 1-year budget. We're in the 20 or so, and I say or so because there's some complications in some states, but we're in the 20 or so states that have a 2-year state budget. So right now we're at the halfway point of the state budget, and we now know we have a better idea anyway, of what revenues looked like for the first half of the state budget. And policymakers, when they're putting together a state budget, it has to balance, right? It's an operating budget, so you don't borrow money to pay for operations. You borrow money to do capital projects, but not to pay for ongoing expenses. Staff and services that are provided directly, and maintaining roads and funding public schools, right? So the operating budget is dependent on what the revenue projections were. And
Right.
State policymakers projected revenues over the 2-year period. And for the first year of the state budget, it looks like the state revenues for the general and education trust funds, which isn't the whole budget, but it's a pretty significant part of it, about 40%, those were about a little under 6% over what was expected. A big portion of that was one time. There were some one-time dollars that came in, what's called a tax amnesty program. Happy to talk about that more if you have questions, but it's a one-time basically pot of money. And that one-time pot of money, if you take that out, then revenues were about 2.7% above what was expected when the state budget was crafted. So what that means is that right now, if spending is going according to plan, which is a different, it's the other side of the equation, right? We don't have as much clarity on the spending side of the equation, but we know about the revenue side of the equation. If spending is going according to plan, then there is a cushion of, right now, it's about $182 million is the estimate at the end of this fiscal year. So again, we're halfway through the state budget. There's that cushion of about $182 million. So what does that mean? That means that policymakers have a little bit of money that they could use for something else. They've already ended their legislative session this year, so they're probably, unless they decide to take something up in the fall, like, they probably aren't going to use it until the next session, right?
Sure.
So that money then probably carries forward into the next state budget discussion, which the legislature will be doing next year. So February to June of 2027, the legislature will be considering the next state budget. So there's this additional money. And what does that mean in the context of property taxes? What does that mean in the context of funding the overall state budget? Those are all valid questions. I'll take the property taxes one first, since that was and how that relates to education funding. If that works for you, Carter.
Yeah, absolutely. That works great for me. Let's do it.
Okay, great. So the education funding that comes from the state, you identified that, it's about $4 billion overall that's spent on local public education in New Hampshire.
Right.
The education funding that comes from the state is a little over $1 billion of that each year. So last state fiscal year 2026, that was $1.08 billion in what's called adequate education aid, which is terminology the state uses that's in response to the Claremont lawsuits in the 1990s.
Right.
That were decided by the state Supreme Court. So that adequate education aid, which is funded mostly on a per pupil basis, right? Mostly based on how many students are there in school districts, which, by the way, that peaked in the 2002-2003 school year. So it's been a declining number of students in aggregate statewide since then. That little more than $1 billion, that funds about mid-20s, 26% of what state school districts, or the school districts around the state in aggregate, report that they spend on funding students, right? On funding local public education. So school districts report to the state every year, here's how much money we spent on all our operations, here's how much money it was per pupil, et cetera. And where did it come from? So it's a little bit more than a quarter that is funded by the state. There's a little bit of federal funds, 6% or so. There in the last year, there's money that's from students paying for school lunches. There's a couple other local sources, right? But the primary source of revenue that school districts have is property taxes, and those are property taxes that are raised locally from your local property tax base. That is the primary source because, broadly, local governments in New Hampshire, they can only do what the state government lets them do in law. Right? So if you're a local government, Carter, and you're saying, I want to raise money to fund a new highway or a new highway bypass, right? If you're in Peterborough, right, you might say, well, like we should make it so people aren't driving through town, right? 202 is over on this one side. Let's have a road going on the other side so that people can get to the other side of 101 and not have to cut through town and zigzag through our traffic lights, right? So the town wants to raise money to do that. The town can't say, let's tax sales, let's tax soda, let's tax carbon, right? Let's tax red mailboxes, right? Like the town can't do that because it's not authorized to in state law, right?
Right.
But what the town can do, the town can raise property taxes, and that's really the only major tax revenue source that towns have, and that cities have, and that school districts have, and that counties have. It's the only major tax revenue source. There are other revenue sources, but if you're on your select board or your school district board, you don't have control over the money the state sends you or the money that the federal government sends you. You don't necessarily have control over how many people are paying for parking in your town, right, and paying the parking
Right.
meter. The one that you do have control over is property taxes. So if you have these service needs and only this much money from other sources, that means property taxes are filling the gap. And that's why if there's less money that comes from the federal government, less money that comes from the state government, less money that comes from other sources, all of that puts upward pressure on property taxes.
Sure. So it's really interesting, and I'm glad we're getting into this because I'm just purely from like just observational, trying to make general projections about this. It seems like it kind of puts the towns in a bit of a bind, right? Because you're saying, well, we're going to put all of the responsibility on the towns to provide all of this funding. But at the same time, because they're not allowed to make specific decisions to alleviate taxation in other ways, and they really can only do it through the property tax, it seems like it would cause people in towns to then be sort of frustrated with the town itself for constantly raising this one tax that they already feel like is way too high anyways. Um, and it just, the downshift of it seems to be sort of like there's not a lot of wiggle room there in order to actually create a sense of security or mobility for the people in the town to spread the taxation out in a way that creates a more fair alignment, right? Because property taxes themselves are, I always say that, a property tax is regressive in the sense that it doesn't care about what your position is, right? If you're suddenly out of a job, that it's not like your property tax is going to be on hold, right? But if you were, say, paying an income tax, well, you're not going to be taxed on income that you're not making. The sales tax is regressive in the same way, where if somebody's making $30,000, they're paying a greater portion of that tax compared to what they earn as somebody who's making $300,000 a year. You know what I mean? So that shifts the greater portion of responsibility onto the less affluent members of the state. And so, like I always try to go to the example of like, you've got, somebody who's in their 70s, right? And they're living on like the family farm that they've owned for generations, you know what I mean? But they're on a fixed income. They're not able to work anymore. Maybe their particular line of work really heavily relied on using their body. You know what I mean? It's not a desk job. It's not like a work from home opportunity. So they're relying on Social Security, maybe some sort of retirement if they have one. But those property taxes go up. They just continue to increase. And that person who's living on that fixed income may all of a sudden find themselves completely priced out of a home that has been theirs for generations. And that seems to be, I don't know, that just on its face, that doesn't feel fair. And I don't think that's necessarily a partisan take per se, because I've talked to people all over the political spectrum, and nobody likes that. Nobody likes the idea of like, oh, you're kicking grandma out of her house. Like, what the heck are you doing, dude? So it's weird because there's this significant amount of downshifting that occurs. And then at the same time, you brought up the Claremont decision, which I think is incredibly relevant to this conversation. But furthermore, we have the Conval case, which also went through more recently, which basically reaffirmed a lot of the results of the Claremont decision. And so the state still is sort of in this position of not adequately funding education by the decision of the courts. That's again not a partisan take. That's just what the courts said. So and I understand that there's a lot of effort in Concord to sort of try and subvert or divert public tax dollars into the education freedom accounts, right? So that people are able to use that money for non-public school opportunities, and under the guise of it's flexible and it's school choice, and you're given better options when your local school is not able to deliver for you. But at the same time, I can't help but think, well, Jesus, isn't that still diverting money away from public schools that are already underfunded? And that blame seems to be mostly carried by the towns. So it's very much so a way for the state to say, like, hey, we didn't do it. You know what I mean? This is just that your town did this. And so I'm just sort of, that's a general take, and I don't know that there's so much of a question there. Is it's just like, this is a thing that I ponder, and I wonder from the analysis side of things what the read on that take is for just the regular person looking at this problem.
Yeah, so I'll pull on three threads, if I could, from what you said.
Yeah, of course.
One is that New Hampshire relies more on property taxes than any other state in the country to fund public services.
Right.
And other than the utility property tax, which is raised by the state directly from utilities, all property taxes in New Hampshire that are true property taxes are raised and retained locally. So there is a statewide education property tax. The state used to actually collect money from that. The state doesn't collect money physically from that anymore. All of that money stays with local governments. So the state requires local governments to raise it, but it's effectively an add-on to the local property tax, which,
Right.
by the way, if you count that all together, that means that school districts are raising 72% of the money that they use to fund their operations, the education of students, from local property taxes.
Right.
And that's, if we look at towns, we look at counties, they're all relying on local property tax bases. And when you get to the municipal level, right, some of our towns are pretty small, and there's a big difference in the fiscal capacity of that property tax base to fund services when you go from town to town, right, or city to city. Do you have waterfront property? Do you have a ski area that people want to have second homes in? Do you have a big industrial site or facility?
Right.
Do you have a lot of commercial property? Do you have a lot of homes that are of high value and that don't have a lot of students in them, especially, or a lot of people living in them, period, right? Those are all things that can affect what the property tax base is relative to what your service needs are. And that, because we are so reliant on local property taxes in New Hampshire and local tax bases in particular, because it's not just property taxes, it is that when you cross the border from town to town or city to town, there's a big difference in the fiscal capacity, or there can be a big difference in the fiscal capacity of those communities. And that can make
Right.
it, sort of easier or harder to raise property taxes and to raise revenue for services more generally. And that interacts with, how do property taxes impact people based on their income? Generally, the lowest income households and middle income households have a higher effective tax rate from property taxes and from state and local taxes overall in New Hampshire than the highest income households. So the
Right.
modeling from the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy suggests the bottom 20% of family units, which could be individuals or could be families, but basically tax units, bottom 20% paid in state and local taxes an effective tax rate of close to 9%. And for the top 1% of households, it was an effective tax rate of a little under 3%. So it was about a 3-to-1 ratio relative to incomes. Now, again, that's relative to incomes. That's not total number of dollars, right?
Right.
Because there aren't that many dollars at the bottom 20%, and there are a lot of dollars at the top 1%. But relative to incomes, it reflects that property taxes are really, they're a tax on wealth. It's wealth that is taxed every year, but wealth is not necessarily reflective of someone's property taxed wealth, I should say, is not necessarily
Right.
reflective of someone's total wealth or ability to pay in that moment, in the same way that it was 100 years ago, 125 years ago, when we were mostly an
Yes.
agricultural society, right? And most of
Right.
the wealth that you would have as an individual would show up in the property that you have, that you own, and is physically available, right?
Right.
Whether that's livestock, whether that's fuel tanks the state used to tax, whether it's mills, stock in trade, right? There's all sorts of things the state used to tax as part of property or business-ish taxes.
Yes.
And now we've shifted most of that to property taxes that are more generic property taxes. And I say now, this was more than 50 years ago,
Right.
and business taxes that are more broad-based in terms of what are your profits, what's your business enterprise value tax base, et cetera. So what that means is that we are taxing a certain type of wealth that doesn't necessarily reflect someone's income. It can, but doesn't all the time. And taxing that wealth more and more to raise more money at the very local level, and only taxing it based on those small property tax bases. And that results in a pretty uneven distribution of what is the effective tax rate across income groups.
Right. Right. Absolutely. Well, and I would also imagine that the reality that is you can say that property is a form of wealth, which is accurate. But there's not a direct correlation to something like, say, owning a stock, right? Where if you own a
Right.
stock and you're holding it and the value of the stock goes up, you're not actively taxed on that until you decide to sell your shares, right? That's the moment at which you receive the taxation on that particular sale of a stock. Whereas if you own a home and the property value gets reassessed and goes up, you haven't been able to realize the gains of selling that house because you're still living in it, but you are now paying more for it. And that doesn't relate. It's not like you were suddenly able to get a huge raise at work that accounts for that. So that seems like a pretty big snag in the works there. I think it's interesting that you bring up sort of the agricultural roots of the state, where at that particular time, property taxes did actually function much more like an income tax. That was sort of the conception of the idea, was like, we're only going to tax you on your ability to earn, right? Because it was so tied, what you owned was tied to what you could make in terms of money. So I always find it fascinating that it's like, well, we don't want an income tax in this state. If to go back to this sort of like, Mel Thompson and union leader talking point from mid 1900s, it's yeah, sure, but that's not actually the formulation historically of why we have the system we have. Things shifted. And so I think this has a bit of a dovetail a little bit in terms of there's the general conversation that's happening right now with sort of Andrew Valinsky and Cliff Below's proposal with the 3-3 tax affordability plan. Which I think is interesting, because they're coming out and making a proposal, right? I mean, and they're not even necessarily, it's not legislation. It's not like it's going through the state house in any capacity. They were just like, let's write this up and see what everybody thinks about it. And then all of a sudden, Andrew Valinsky's getting death threats, which is sort of ridiculous. But just literally for saying the word income tax in the state of New Hampshire, I think is the darkly comedic. But it's I'm genuinely curious, from just an analysis perspective, looking at like sort of the tax burden and what would make the most sense in terms of long-term sustainability. Is there value in examining other broad-based tax methods? Would doing something like bringing back the interest and dividends tax or the estate tax, would stuff like that actually create genuine opportunities to alleviate sort of the imbalance that we're experiencing right now?
That's so, and I'm glad you brought up the interest and dividends tax, because that was also a tax on a form of wealth, but it was wealth that generates income, and then a tax on that
Right.
income, right? You
Right.
mentioned capital gains, right? That is, if you own a stock, which by the way is much more portable and transferable than someone's house, right? And
Right.
has a very different impact on someone's life if they're selling their stock versus selling a house.
Yep.
So and that's a capital gains tax, a lower value to upper value, or you might hold that stock and then earn dividends and distributions from it, from that ownership of the company. But those are all forms of income, right? And the property tax in New Hampshire is a form on a tax on certain types of wealth, certain forms of
Right.
types of wealth, and that is much more likely to impact a much broader swath of the population than, for example, the interest and dividends tax did. At least most of the money, the majority of money raised from the interest and dividends tax was from filers in its latest years, from filers that had $200,000 a year or more in taxable interest and dividend income alone, right? So you had to have a lot of wealth to generate $200,000 in interest and dividend income that was taxable without selling any of it, right? No capital gains involved there. That was just, you had this wealth, and that could be ownership of your own company, right? That's generating that income for you. But it is not something you have to sell to generate that income that was then taxed.
Right.
So you'd have to have for $200,000 a year in income, you'd have to have millions of dollars of wealth, or the equivalent of millions of dollars of wealth, if you have anything that's like a reasonable rate of return on either a stock or a distribution. So one of the reasons that the state, to your question about other types of revenue, one of the reasons why the state is not as reliant on one type of revenue source as local governments are, and why people feel the property tax in ways that they don't feel some of the other state taxes or taxes that we have in the state, is because the state has a much broader array of revenue options, right? It has the business profits tax, the meals and rentals tax, the business enterprise tax, the Medicaid enhancement tax, the motor fuels tax, the insurance premium tax, right? The tobacco tax. These are all different taxes on different parts of the economy. And you can adjust them, right? Or the state could adjust them in ways that do not directly impact people as much as one tax, the property tax, that is already relatively high in New Hampshire on a per capita basis. In 2022, we paid more in property taxes than any other state in the country except New Jersey. So they're relatively high here. And that, increasing that further, ratcheting that up further, means that there's that means that people are feeling that pressure point more than they do if the meals and rentals tax is adjusted upward by half a percentage point or downward by half a percentage point like it was in 2021. So that diverse array of revenue sources that the state has is an asset for stabilizing revenues and making it so you're not leaning too heavily on one part of the economy, as opposed to property taxes, which, there's a lot of property, right? It's a relatively broad base. But within the town or city that you're talking about, it's a pretty narrow base because it's only within the borders of that town. And it's a tax that is really your only lever to raise money at the local level from taxation. And one piece I want to mention, there's the three plan in particular. A lot of focus was on the 3% on the income tax side. But the that's the property tax side, the $3 per thousand property tax side. That was proposing, well, and I don't want to put words in either Andy or Cliff's mouths for this, right? But that was proposing basically making the whole state be part of the property tax base. And that broadens it much further, because then the town border, the city border, doesn't matter nearly so much for funding public education, because if you're raising the money statewide with the state as your property tax base, and not just whether you happen to have waterfront property or a large industrial facility within your town or not, that means that the statewide property tax base can then raise the money in a way that reflects what a particular property is more, and the value of that relative to the statewide average, as opposed to what a particular town's collection of properties happen to be, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, definitely. It does make sense. And I think, that's, everybody focuses on the income tax portion of that. And I thought that the actual property tax portion that they were talking about was just as fascinating to me as the income tax portion. I thought it was a really interesting proposal. And it's like, I would like it if people would be able to like entertain it to a certain extent, just because I do see these conflicts where there's so much emphasis on the town level and the school district level in terms of raising the revenue. And it can, it's like, and you have towns like school districts, like, Conval was a good example. Conval's 9 towns that participate in that high school, and the conflict between towns over that money is pretty intense. It can get fairly heated, and it sort of in some ways pits towns against each other, which seems like not a great way to handle things, and to sort of flatten it at the state level seems that it removes some of the potential animosity that would occur or could occur in between, different townships, so that we're not sort of always fighting with each other on the lowest level. And then I think, we've mentioned the statewide education property tax a couple times, and what I think is fascinating about this, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it's like when I think about it being sort of collected and held locally, but it is a state tax and it's sort of considered a state level thing, but they're asking the towns themselves to be the ones to administer those taxes. That seems fraught to me, because it's a way for the state to say, hey, look, we're doing something, but really the actual onus of collecting and managing all of that money still stays with the towns. And that's it seems like a neat little trick to sort of take responsibility for doing what feels like absolutely no work. Maybe, and then that's, I don't want to mischaracterize. I think that would be that's bipartisan. You know what I mean? That's and that's not just the responsibility of one party or another. They're both, the pledge exists, and candidates of both parties will take the pledge. So there's a certain amount of tax prescriptions that are fairly ubiquitous regardless of what political party you're talking about.
So the statewide education property tax is there was a state Supreme Court case about that last year too, which changed some components of it, some of the wonky components of it, but didn't change the fundamental structure that the money's raised and retained locally by local governments. And it wasn't that way in its initial stages. It wasn't that way in the past when it was created. It was created and set at a rate of $6.60 per thousand, which is much higher than it is now, to basically raise money. And if school districts, or really communities, raised more than the state owed them through the education funding formula, then that additional money would go back to the state. Some people might remember the terminology donor towns and receiver towns from 20 some years ago, right? And that makes it, I think, speaking to your question about how it's strange that it's administered at the town and city level, that makes it so that all the money is collected locally and then transferred as a block. So even though individuals are being taxed, like the individual houses and businesses, et cetera, are the ones being taxed, it's collected in a way that makes it appear as here's this block of money, and a portion of that is then transferred away, or used to be transferred away, to another community. And that, I think people perceive that as different than, like, why is my town donating as why is my town receiving, right? Or why is this other town receiving? Those are my local property taxes. Shouldn't they be used in my community? Well, there were two changes to statewide education property tax since its inception. One was it was set in 2005 to raise $363 million. So, and that's not adjusted for inflation. So it's a declining source of revenue over time, so to speak, for education funding. And the second is that in 2011, there was a law change that made it so that there was no more sharing between communities. So there are no more donor towns and receiver towns when it comes to education funding, right? That hasn't existed for 14 years. So if you still hear that out in the world, that's not the case anymore. It was the case. It was important a while ago, but it's not the case anymore. So, and one thing I do want to note there, if you're a community that has a lot of property wealth, or relatively few students, or a combination of those two, then you may be keeping more in statewide education property tax revenue than the state actually owes you through the education funding formula. And since 2012, or since the law change in 2011, those communities have kept what's called excess swept revenue, excess statewide education property tax revenue, which effectively means that those communities de facto receive more state education aid. I do want to caveat that, yes, they receive more de facto state education aid on paper, but it's not more cash coming from the state because it's all raised locally. right? It's
Right.
all raised through the
Exactly.
statewide education property tax locally. I know this clear as mud, but the
Yeah.
statewide education
Yeah.
property tax, it is a state tax in that if the state didn't have it, it would have to raise the revenue for the education funding formula that's currently raised for by the statewide education property tax from somewhere else, right? There'd have to be
Right.
another tax revenue source to fund the education funding formula. But all the money is raised and retained locally, and local governments have to administer it and run it. And this is why it went back to the state Supreme Court, because the Claremont lawsuits, particularly the second Claremont lawsuit in the 1990s, and I should say I'm not an attorney, right? So this is going to be imprecise, right? But that second Claremont lawsuit was focused on the equitability of taxation across communities for education funding. It was less about the dollar amount and more about the inequity between communities for funding public education, and the state had to do something about that inequity. The state Supreme Court case that we saw last year, that state policymakers haven't really responded to yet comprehensively, although the next time they would be in the next state budget potentially. So that'll be next year. They could have responded in 2026, but they didn't do much to respond to it in 2026. So that Supreme Court case was a little bit of a difference, right? It reaffirmed some things from the 1990s, but also said there should be a certain amount of money provided, right? Or recommended that there be a certain amount of money as a floor, as a reasonable floor provided.
Mm-hmm.
And then the legislature could provide more too. So again, we'll have to see how the different branches of government interact on this. I don't have a forecast for you on that front.
No, of course.
But it is different in that it was saying not just the state has to supply money to make the funding more equitable from the funding sources, but also saying the state has to supply more money to actually fund an adequate education. That's my quasi layperson's, not an attorney, interpretation of some of the key differences between those Claremont lawsuits in the 1990s and what we saw last year, and that the legislature may decide to tackle next year.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. So, and I appreciate that, because again, like you say, it's clear as mud, and I always think that's so funny, but because I feel like that's like the goal, right? Is to have it be very overlapping and it is, opaque in terms of being able to really understand what's going on, because I would imagine that if you were a bit more, I don't know what the particular word for this is, but devious, maybe is the correct term, about wanting to direct people's ire towards something that isn't you, as maybe a politician or a lawmaker. It seems like having these sort of like, on paper it's one way, in reality it's another, kind of distinctions creates a layer of plausible deniability, where somebody could say, look, like that's not the way we did it. I don't know what to tell you. It's just, that's not how it's written. It's actually this other thing, but then there is sort of a de facto responsibility that's carried in a way that is exactly what people experience, in terms of the, again, to that downshifting point of saying, well, yes, on paper it's state money, but everything is done on the locality level. And I think, my personal attitude towards the term downshifting, which gets used a lot in New Hampshire for good reason, is I think the part of the analogy that people don't always talk about, right, is that you can downshift the cost of something. But if you're thinking about it in terms of like, I'm riding a bicycle or I'm driving a car, the lower the gear you are in, it might be easy to get started, right? It's easy to jump off the line if you're at a full stop. But the maximum speed you can go for the amount of fuel or energy, right, with your legs that you have to expend to go a certain speed is much more costly to you. And the whole point of that is to then shift up, right? So that you've already reached a base operating speed, right? So now you can use a higher gear, which would take more effort if you weren't already moving at the pace that you're moving. And what it actually does is allows you to move faster or be more effective with less energy output because the gear ratio has gone up. And I always think that that's the part of the analogy that people don't think about as much, but I think it's very applicable to the situation that we're dealing with right now, where, to the point about like the sort of the 3% in the tax proposal plan, the tax affordability plan, where it generalizes things to the state level. I think about how if we take this concept of upshifting, right, in terms of energy output, that would actually create a certain amount of relief on a local level, assuming there was some sort of provision that said like, okay, if we do this though, local towns, you do have to lower your property tax rates. Like you can, because that's always when I hear the sort of the counter argument against an income tax, people will point to places like Connecticut where it's not necessarily bracketed, and they'll say, well, yeah, but it didn't actually alleviate any of the problems, and now they have crazy high tax rates. And like, yeah, but that's also because they never locked in there was no balancing act done to reduce that local level taxation that would have caused relief at that particular level. So it's like, yeah, well, now we're just operating in two gears at the same time. Somehow that seems like it works. And it's, and really the taxpayers are the ones that sort of shoulder the burden of that. And I'm wondering, it's like, I sit here and have this thought as somebody just outside of a lot of the decision making and the experience of it, but I'm wondering if from an analysis perspective on your end, if that actually is that a valid way to look at it?
So when you say it, do you mean the relationship
the
between
general
state and local?
yeah.
Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, is that a valid way to consider the concept of downshifting, the downshifting or sort of upshifting, and to follow the extension of my analogy here? Is that a reasonable way to sort of try and simplify the concept?
Yeah, so I think it's important for people to remember that, and to help with this way of thinking about it. I think it's important for people to remember that there's strong fiscal relationships between these different levels of government. Like a third of the state budget
Right.
is funded with federal transfers, right? And then we've already
Right.
talked about the component of the local government funding that comes from the state, right? We're talking,
Yeah.
depending on whether you're counting SWEPT or not as state aid, 20-some%, right? So, if there's more money that's raised at the state level, whether it's through the statewide education property tax and then redistributed, or raised through some other revenue source, and then sent to local governments, I think what you're identifying is that there are people who are then concerned of like, oh, well, then, it won't actually lower property taxes, right? It may
Right.
reduce the upward pressure on property taxes, but if you've downshifted, you're still sort of spinning your wheels, right? And then you're trying to do all the things, right, that are that you're doing at the local level, and you have more resources to do it, but it takes a lot of energy because you're doing it all locally, as opposed to it might be more efficient at a higher speed at the state level. So there's, but at the same time, structurally, right, we're not in a situation now where there's other ways to raise revenue to fund things like you need a new school building, or you need to fix a road, or the health insurance premiums for your police, firefighters, and teachers have gone up, right?
Yeah.
There are some costs that communities face that may be outpacing the revenue they get from other sources, which is why that puts that upward pressure on property taxes. So that revenue from other sources, it's, in one community, they might use it to lower property taxes dollar for dollar. In another community, they might say, we have all this deferred maintenance. We really need to fix this mold problem in this building that members of the public are using, right? Like those, so that's also a valid reason, right? And I think everyone in the community would agree, but then it doesn't lower property taxes, right? Because you're using that money for that. So, to understand how the fiscal relationship between the state government and local governments could be structured in a way that incentivizes lower property taxes. I think that incentivizes component is important. The state
Yeah.
could force local governments, and indeed, as you pointed out, local governments may have an opportunity to force themselves later to have local property tax
Right.
caps, right, or more opportunity to do so in the 2026 and 2028 general elections.
Yeah.
So, local governments can force themselves to keep their taxes low. The state government could also, again, we're not a home rule state in New Hampshire, so local governments are at the whim of sort of what the state sets out as parameters for them.
Exactly.
And the state could say, you are not allowed to raise property taxes or raise property taxes by this amount or whatever it may be. But then that means that local government that has the mold problem in the building, right? Well, how are they going to raise the money to do it if they
Right.
don't have other revenue sources, right?
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
And then if you try to freeze it in time, is it right sized for everyone? If you say, okay, where your property taxes are now, that's what they're going to be, or that's what they're going to be plus 2% a year, and we'll fill in more money accordingly, or you're going to have to lower it by 50% and then only increase it 2% a year. Those are all ways that you could restructure that relationship between state government and local governments.
Right.
I tend to think that incentives that communities get differing amounts of aid depending on what happens with their property taxes and what happens with their service needs, and having a more sophisticated way of measuring what a need is in a community, and also respecting the local control that a lot of people do value in New Hampshire, right?
Right.
That if you have a hard switch to another revenue source that local governments don't have as much control over too, then that may affect local control, right?
Yeah.
I think that having an incentive structure is one of the ways that if people thought about that with regard to property taxes and the state and local relationship with regard to property taxes, it would permit more flexibility than sort of hard and fast laws that would come down from the state, but would also make sure that some of the additional aid, were aid to come from the state, would go directly to property tax alleviation or lowering property taxes.
Sure.
But again, the downside of that is that nothing is guaranteed. Then there's just the incentives in place to help get it to that point.
Yeah, exactly. No, and I mean, and look, when I say this stuff, I'm not necessarily trying to be too prescriptive about it, right? Because I am always of the opinion, like, there's a bunch of different ways to crack an egg, right? And in that sense, I think the incentive thing is good in the truest sense of maintaining sort of local control over it, right? It's like you can have the state say, oh, you can't do this, and it comes from the top down, and that's sort of like the stick, right? Or you can do the carrot version, which is going to your local, your selectman or your mayor or whatever, and saying, so they've done this, and we would like to see a reduction in our local property taxes, and if you don't do that, then we will put a candidate up, in next election cycle that would be willing to do that. And you'll face a challenger. So, and then that pressure is coming from the people. And I think that's a better way to do things, honestly. Like, I like that idea a little bit more because that's the carrot, right? In that analogy. But I do think there's a lot of value in looking at different ways to try to create that opportunity. But I do, I wonder if at that point it requires a certain type of messaging in order to make it work, right? Because if you're not sort of letting voters know that that's something that they could even be doing, then they don't, you don't know what you don't know. You can't know what you don't know. So you're not able to act upon that. I think that's maybe a bit of a snag with the carrot option. Whereas if it's just a certain decree by the state that says, hey, we're doing this, statewide property tax, just, and we are going to collect it. We are going to hold it. We're going to do that, out in Concord, then it's not on the localities. And they say, so we're doing this. So, the state recommends that all municipalities balance their local property taxes in a way that is no longer so burdensome to their local economy. Because I do genuinely worry about the this rising property tax that people are experiencing, because it is creating a specific type of resident that can survive in this state. And the people that it generally excludes are the people that are sort of most key to a functioning economy, in the sense that if you're pricing out service workers or you're pricing out tradesmen, then those people that are building houses, that are working at restaurants, that are doing, like working the counter at the gas station, whatever, right? Like, those jobs are incredibly necessary. Your ambulance drivers, your, like hospital staff that are doing, just filing work, because there's a lot of paperwork that needs to happen in hospitals, nursing staff and whatnot. If these people are suddenly finding themselves priced out of living in the state, but you're having sort of like people that have made a lot of money off of, investing over the years, and they're, say, moving here from New Jersey or New York, and they're like, oh, well, I want to move to a state that's more remote. I want to get out of the big city. And New Hampshire is very friendly in terms of, being a bit of a tax haven, in the sense that we're just not going after those bigger chunks of wealth. So I can buy, like, a nice but modest property, and I can eat the property tax on that, especially if it's in a property wealthy town where they, the rates are maybe lesser or whatever. So I get to live in a really nice place. Property tax is sort of acceptable. And I can just sort of chill out. But it's like, as that population ages, as they need things, as they need services, they need groceries, they need whatever, right? A lot of the grocery stores in my area rely heavily on high school students to do the labor for them. Most of that is very much so like the youth. And if you're pricing families out, then who are going to do those jobs? And that, to me, I worry about sort of a longer term economic collapse, where it's like, if you genuinely put all of your eggs in the basket of like, okay, we're going to make this a retirement community state, who manages the necessary jobs for the local economies? That's my biggest concern there. And sort of just when thinking about this emphasis on property tax, I just wonder, like, what are potential pitfalls to putting all our eggs in that basket?
Yeah, and I want to emphasize not just the interstate comparisons there, but also the intrastate, right? If we go from one community to another, because part of putting all our eggs, or a lot of our eggs, right? If we look at where state and local tax revenue comes from, 63% of our eggs, right, in that local property taxes basket. That means that communities' abilities to invest in themselves and their people is highly dependent on the property wealth, the taxable property wealth in those communities. So
right.
What does that mean, right? Like I just said some funky economic words together, but like what does that actually mean?
Yeah.
It means that if you're a community that already has high value houses, if you already are desirable or perceived to be a desirable place to live, if you have a power plant, or a big, a couple big manufacturing plants, or a big healthcare facility that is a for-profit healthcare facility in this case, if it's if you have a ski area where a lot of people want to have second homes, right, or there are a lot of rental properties, right? If you have waterfront, whether it's on the ocean or on a desirable lake, right? Those are all things that boost property values. And in this case, boosting a property value then means that you have a larger tax base, and you can, in some cases, right, you can raise more money more easily, so to speak, from that tax base. Also, if it's a desirable place to live, then people who have the means to live there are, and this is again between towns. Yes, there's the interstate component, but this is between towns within the state. If you have the means to live there, if you have the income to live there, or the wealth and assets to live there, then you may be more likely to be you're more likely to be able to move in, to afford some place to live there, and afford the property taxes.
Right.
And that means that the communities where people can't afford those things, are more likely to have, maybe higher concentrations of people who are not able to move to those more desirable places to live, or places that are perceived to be more desirable to live. And as a result, then those communities, which might have lower property values, may also have more difficulty paying for the property taxes that local leaders would need to invest in something like more amenities and educational opportunities at the school districts, right?
Right.
And then there's an intergenerational mobility component, because if we're relying so much on local property taxes to fund local public schools, then people who, and there's a lot of perceptions about school districts, so I don't have any names to name, and I think that there are some school districts that probably serve students quite well that people don't perceive they serve as well, and vice versa. But those school districts that provide more opportunity, more advanced classes, more more after school activities, more enrichment activities, are able to pay their teachers more and attract more teachers who have expertise in the fields that they're teaching and have credentials in the fields that they're teaching. Those communities then provide more upward mobility to their students. And if those communities are already more likely to be the ones that are disproportionately higher income or higher wealth communities, because they can afford to pay for those educational services, then there's potentially a cycle there of communities sort of drifting apart, right? That there are some communities that are able to invest in themselves in that way and able to attract more businesses and more residents, and some communities that won't be able to, or that are less able to. And it's not as bifurcated as, there's half the communities in the state are doing well and half the communities in the state are doing badly, right? It's not that clear of a line, but those are all factors that the current structure of relying on local property taxes for a community to invest in itself through public resources, those are all factors that affect that community's, any community in the state's ability to do that. So there are the interstate movers, but there are also the intrastate pieces that also mean that people who, let's say you're working at a gas station counter, or that you are waiting tables, or that you are working, in one of them, you're providing health services to people who are older adults aging in their homes, right?
Absolutely.
That's, if you're a worker who's doing that, but you can't afford to live anywhere near where your work is, you might still be living in New Hampshire, but you might have a long commute, right? You might have those additional costs associated with it. So these are all things that structurally, and New Hampshire's not unique in this way, but we are the most reliant on local property taxes, particularly of any state in the country on average. These are not things that are unique phenomena to New Hampshire or unique at this period in history, but we structurally in the state have a funding for public services structure that enables and probably exacerbates some components of those trends.
Right, exactly. So thank you. This is wonderful stuff. We earlier brought up sort of just like the non-tax revenue, and I always kind of want to like ask a little bit about this because we talk about like fees and expenses and things like that, and I've had people from out of state ask me when they look at it, they're like, well, you guys you do everything with the property tax? It's like, you guys just don't do taxes? And I'm like, we have a ton of tiny little fees that pay for a whole lot of stuff. So it's like there's still like, if you want to consider those fees kind of like taxes, then no, we're not really any different than anybody else. We absolutely still just harangue you left and right. And some of those things are absolutely ridiculous. But that is a huge portion of the way that we pay for things. And I think you actually, I'm trying to scroll through. I think there was a pie chart that you guys have, and I'll post a link to this in the description of the video because I think it's really important that people do it. But you guys have a sort of how property taxes are in New Hampshire and how they work, and so I would encourage folks to do that. I'll also put the link to the webinar that you guys did down there too, just so that people can follow along through and check this stuff out, because there's a lot of really, really important information in there. But so I just give us a primer on how, because in that pie chart, it could have sworn that it was more than the property tax. And I'm just wondering how all of that how all of that operates, how those sort of non-tax um, revenues come in, and how they
Yeah,
work.
great. Yeah, great question. So if you're just looking at state revenue sources, then property taxes are not the majority. It's only the statewide education property tax and the utility property tax then.
Right.
And if you're looking at state and local tax and non-tax, then property taxes are almost, I think they're the biggest slice of the pie, right? About 30%, but it's not the majority, right? If you're just looking at taxes, it's the majority. It's that 63% is all raised and retained locally. So I know I'm throwing around a lot of numbers, but
Yeah.
I'll spread it out a little bit more here. So if we're looking at state revenue sources, then there we can see that federal funds are about a third. So about a third of the operations of the state, about a third of the stuff that the state government does is funded with federal funds. And some of those funds are matching funds. Actually, most of them are matching funds, meaning the state has to put up some money to access those federal funds. So those don't just appear, right? They have to be drawn down for a particular program. So federal funds are a really significant component, right? It's the most significant non-tax revenue source the state has. The state also runs the Lottery Commission, or Lottery and Gaming Commission, I should say is the new name, and the Liquor Commission. And the Lottery Commission runs the state lottery and also Keno, sports betting, historic horse racing, overseas charitable gaming, runs the new video lottery terminals that the state has, the iLottery people do on their phones, right? All of that generates to some degree or another revenue for the state, but the Lottery and Gaming Commission also has to pay for its own operations and also pay for winnings, which is why people play to begin with, right? So there's a portion then, which is about a third of Lottery and Gaming Commission revenues, but a portion goes to, that's profit, goes to the Education Trust Fund to pay. That portion mostly pays for local public education. The state lottery, the scratch tickets in particular, has to go per the state constitution to pay for local public schools. The Education Trust Fund pays for a little bit more than just local public schools. It also funds the education freedom accounts, for example. But all other types of aid go to public district or charter schools in some form or another. Some of it's tuition transportation aid, some of it's building aid, et cetera. But that comes out of that Education Trust Fund. So there's the Lottery and Gaming Commission, there's the Liquor Commission, which runs the state liquor stores. The profit from that also goes to other state purposes, not necessarily education. Most of it's not education, but goes to other state services. The profit from that on about $715 million in sales and services, it was about $120 million, right? So last fiscal year. So that's a small portion of it, but again, it's a state-run operation, right? It's basically a state-run business where the profits go to serve the rest of the state, but they have to pay for the buildings, they have to pay for the staff, they have to pay for the product that people go to the liquor stores to buy, right? So that's all in their costs. But those are non-tax revenue sources, right? If I don't play lottery and I don't buy liquor, then I'm not only not participating in taxable activity, but I'm not buying those services from the state, right? There are fees. The ones that folks encounter the most or are often the most vocal about are motor vehicle registration fees, but there's also environmental permitting fees. There's also fees for, if you're a restaurant, then you have to pay a fee to get the inspections that you have to legally operate, right? There's fees for various types of licenses that you need to get, or certifications that you need to get to participate in certain business activities. There's a pretty wide array of fees that the state has. We, I believe, are still the only state that runs our state parks only on fee revenue generated by the state parks. I think every other state puts some form of general fund money in it from some other source, but New Hampshire just funds the state parks on their own fee revenues. And our fish and game department runs most years on just its own revenues from licenses and fees. So those are significant operations that the state has that are funded almost entirely on fee revenue. So It is in that array. There are a whole bunch of smaller tax revenue sources, and I listed a couple earlier that we have as well. Some of them are pretty significant, like the business profits tax is, depending on the year you're looking at, between 800 million
Yeah.
and $1 billion, right? So it's a
Yeah.
lot of money.
Yeah.
But it is, all of those are dwarfed by the local property tax in terms of what's raised
Right.
by local property taxes. And fees and fines and these other non-tax revenue sources. Turnpike tolling is another example. When you drive on one of our 89 miles of turnpike in the state, that's a toll, not a tax, right? So
Right.
again, there are some semantics involved in here. Some people may argue,
Yeah.
but it's a user fee basically to drive on the highway, and then those dollars have to be used on those 89 miles of highway.
Sure.
So it's that's not a tax in the same way that, for example, the motor fuels tax is, that when you put gasoline or diesel in your car, you're paying a certain tax, and that's more diffuse in terms of where it could go on
Right.
state highway operations. So there's a pretty wide array, and actually in the current state budget, policymakers raised about 125 fines and fees and various other non-tax revenue sources, as well as increased lottery commission, increased legalized gaming opportunities. Those were some of the ways that they offset the budget shortfall that was generated in part by lower business tax revenues and in part by the repeal of the interest and dividends tax.
Right. Well, and I think one little note that I thought was really fascinating was that the the revenue generated from gambling specifically, like some of the new gambling and the stuff that came through, it was less than what they expected. And I was like, oh, look at that. That's interesting to me. So it's
the video lottery terminals have not done as well as they
yes,
anticipated.
yeah,
Yes.
yeah, exactly. So it's yeah, I mean, I'm not personally against that. I think, look, I'm not everybody can do what they want, and that's totally okay. But I do worry about sort of overemphasizing sort of vice taxing as a mechanism to pay for everything. I don't necessarily think it's the most helpful, because it does sort of it means that we continue to engage in the consumption of those vices, some of which are incredibly predatory, and gambling is one of the ones that I'm very, very concerned about, because it's money. You know what I mean? Like, you can really, like, you can go from doing great to doing really, really horrible really, really fast. You know what I mean? So there's a little bit of concern that I have with that, but that's sort of just a side note and a little thing that I chuckle about. But I'm curious. So, I mean, like, I know that people in New Hampshire really love to state their independence. And, but I do think one thing that you brought up, which is like really key here, is that the federal dollars, matching or not, are responsible for a third, as you said, about a third of our revenue. And so New Hampshire is actually quite reliant on federal dollars to be self-sustaining, which I think is interesting when you hear just general sort of attitudes that come out of certain aspects of the political culture of the state. When you hear people talk about wanting to secede from the union, if you're talking about very extreme points, and I always want to say, like, hey, don't know that that's necessarily the safest idea, especially when I hear that that so much of what we do is directly reliant on federal dollars coming to make New Hampshire operate. It's obviously, it's not more than half, right? It's not like we're completely sustained by the federal government the way certain states would absolutely be. But 1/3 is meaningful. 1/3 means a lot, and for it to not be there would have massive ramifications for the state economy and just for the quality of life, I would imagine. And so I just, do you think that that sort of self-reliance is maybe a little bit overemphasized when it's discussed as a talking point? You know what I mean? Those numbers seem to reflect a different reality.
Yeah, I think that people aren't aware when they're thinking about, and this is something that I think is common for us when we're thinking about public policy debates, right? What's happening at my town meeting? What's happening at my city council? What's happening at my school district? And that feels very disconnected, even if there are facts mentioned in those discussions, right? That feels very disconnected than what's happening in Concord, right? What's happening at the State
Right.
House? What are they deciding on doing? And then what's happening in Congress? What's happening in DC? And
Yeah.
the fiscal relationship between local government, state government, and the federal government is pretty strong, and pretty strong in the direction of money flowing down from the federal
Yeah.
government to the state government, and state government to local governments. So the state government gets about a third of its funding for its operations from the federal government. If you take just Medicaid, which is the single largest program the state operates, and that's access to health coverage for individuals who have lower incomes, limited assets, certain medical conditions such as a disability or a developmental disability, for example. If you're an older adult who can't afford long-term care, right? You spend down your assets, you have low income, and then you're able to go on Medicaid as well. This is a program that provides access to, the last numbers that I saw from May of this year, about 168,000 Granite Staters. So about 12% of us in the state access healthcare through Medicaid. Medicaid, if you take all of the federal revenue together, which is about $1.6 billion, you take all facets of the Medicaid program and count the federal revenue only, so not the state's matching portion, but just the federal part that's drawn down. That's the single largest revenue source the state has, right? When I'm talking about the state government on its own, right? So this is not including local property taxes, right?
Sure.
State government on its own, it's the single largest program the state has. So anytime you hear something about Medicaid in Congress, right, what that means is that the state might, the amount of money the state gets might change. Last year, with the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, the federal government changed Medicaid laws going forward that will reduce the amount of revenue the state gets to the tune of, according to the healthcare analysis firm KFF, about $2.3 billion over the next 9 years in federal funding that would have been there. That's not going to be, right?
It's a lot of money.
Pretty significant, right? Yeah. And that means then that to fund the same level of Medicaid services, the state will have to raise those $2.3 billion from somewhere else. Right. Well, if the state government has to raise $2.3 billion over 9 years from somewhere else, do you think they're going to have, back to the beginning of our conversation, do you think they're going to have what they consider surplus money available to offset local property taxes or to try to provide more aid to local governments? It's less likely, right? It's less likely that that would be the case. So that's where this fiscal relationship between the federal government, the state government, local governments, I think starts to, when people realize how important the numbers are, right, how significant it is, how it's a third of the state budget is funded with federal transfers, I think people start to realize then what are the ramifications of those federal policy changes and what does that look like on the ground for me as a resident of New Hampshire? Because even if I'm not on Medicaid, right, it will affect probably my healthcare costs generally, right? Because the hospitals have to find money from somewhere else and the healthcare providers have to find money from somewhere else. If there's suddenly a whole bunch more people who are uninsured, right? My healthcare costs personally are probably going to go up. And my property taxes might go up too, faster than they would have otherwise. So that, when it comes to the reliance or not reliance on the federal government, New Hampshire's about typical in terms of our reliance on federal funds to fund public services. Sure. There are states that are on the extremes and we aren't on the extreme. We're pretty close to the middle on that front. But I don't think people have a good sense. Sometimes people are on Medicaid in New Hampshire and they don't actually realize they're on Medicaid because they're on a managed care organization's plan that has a private sector name, right? But the actual funding comes from Medicaid. So I think that if we were to raise more money locally for our services to offset lost federal revenue, which again, to a certain extent, we're going to probably have to over the next 10 years in New Hampshire, I think people will either be surprised at the services that are reduced or the ways that money would have to be raised, or the pressure points that raising those dollars would only locally have to be, because it ends up being a fair bit of money, especially in the New Hampshire context, if the federal funds were to suddenly go away, for example. And that's what's going into the state budget, not what's going into the broader economy, right? Not Social Security, which was $8 billion in funds to households, right? So people on Social Security in, I think that was 2022. or 2024 rather, was that $8 billion figure. That's not counting Medicare, which is a federally administered health coverage for generally for adults 65 and older. That's not counting the $2 billion in defense contracts that come into the state's economy, right? Like there's a lot of other money too, outside of that third in the state budget that affects the well-being of granted staters. So the changes the federal government makes can have a big impact, not just on state operations, not just on what local governments can or cannot do with money that may or may not arrive to them, but also on the state's economy overall.
Yeah, totally. And so you mentioned this earlier because I think it's a little interesting. The tax amnesty program. Yeah, just tell us about that a little bit.
Yeah, the tax amnesty program is something that the state has done periodically. And what that is a program that basically says if you have unpaid taxes to the state of New Hampshire, whether they're business taxes, whether interest and dividends tax, meals and rentals tax, real estate transfer tax, if you have unpaid taxes that you owe the state of New Hampshire, and you pay it within a certain window, then we are going to, in this latest iteration, waive your penalties and cut the interest in half. So it's basically as if you don't have to owe as much, right? And it's as if you didn't violate the law by not paying your taxes, right? That's the amnesty component, right? And that we had done it in 2016, or actually the state had done it in 2016 and raised $19 million that way. In the tail end of, or during the middle of fiscal year 2026, so December, January, and the first half of February of this year, the state also ran a tax amnesty program and brought in $103.8 million, right? So that's a very significant amount of money, much more than they projected in their budget proposal, or in the budget that passed. Of course, that amount of money is, it's not, it's if you were writing a state budget and saying, here's how much we're going to bring in tax amnesty, maybe you wouldn't have projected that much because you don't know what's out there, right? But most of that money came from audits of ongoing audits of business taxes that the state was already conducting that were then resolved by the businesses just paying the tax amnesty amount. So that was a very significant portion of those revenues, and most of it, 96%, I think, of the revenues were from the two business taxes, the business profits tax and the business enterprise tax. There was very little from the other tax revenue sources overall.
Right.
So that's one-time money, and the reason I called it one-time money, yes, if the state did it again in 10 years, would it get another significant amount of money? Sure, that's possible. But if it did it next year, it wouldn't be able to get that much more money because everyone who was, presumably most of the people who were going to do the tax amnesty program did it this year. Because again, the last time that one happened was 10 years ago. And it raised only $19 million then. So it's raised substantially more in the interim. And that is probably a function primarily of both changes to the business profits tax over time and changes to the tax base in terms of how it's calculated, and also that the business profits tax has become more and more important in state revenues as corporate profits nationally have gone up a lot, and the business profits tax has expanded as a revenue source. Even as the rates have been reduced and the tax base has changed, revenues from the business profits tax have gone up most years, not all years, but most years. And we've seen that while revenues have gone up substantially in New Hampshire, they've gone up substantially more in our 5 neighboring New England states and around the country overall. So that's not a unique phenomenon to New Hampshire. And actually, we're maybe behind on that front. And those tax rate reductions that we've seen over the last 10 years probably contributed to us being behind on that front.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, thank you for enlightening that, because I certainly didn't know about it myself, but I think that's interesting. I mean, it's unfortunate, I guess, in a way that people would consider it super helpful when it is, as you point out, one time. But it is good to know that it's there, and it's something that we can do at some point or another if we're sort of in a bind. And I think it's kind of a win for everybody, where it's like, oh yeah, we've got a big windfall for the state on this one-off situation, and a whole bunch of people who are sort of feeling maybe pinched by their unpaid taxes are able to just sort of get out. And I think that's a good thing to do. Last question for today, and this might be a little bit more sort of like more of a meta question, just as in terms of you guys, New Hampshire Fiscal Policy Institute is non-partisan. And I think that's one of the most beautiful things about you guys, is that you're not here to pick a side. You're just here to deliver data. But I very frequently see data be used and be presented in such a way that is sort of within an agenda. And I think sort of the most immediate example that I can think of are sort of these like top 10 lists, you know what I mean? Where it's like, you see like, oh, New Hampshire is number 2 or number 5 in terms of like, you know, best, lowest tax burden or whatever, right? And everybody will point to it and they'll be like, look, see, we're awesome. And I always look at those and I'm like, yeah, but that just feels like I know that there's other data out there that really it will very much so counter this point, that's not included, but it will be sort of held up for political talking points or whatever. Sometimes the way that data is collected is not necessarily the best way. But it still comes from what seems like a relatively reputable source, you know, but then again, you know, once like you actually dig into the methodology on how that data was extrapolated, it's like, well, I don't know about that. Actually, it's sort of dubious. So just in terms of just the general position that you and more broadly New Hampshire Fiscal Policy Institute have is like, you know, how do you guys feel about sort of just the, I don't, maybe this might be a bit hyperbolic, but just sort of like the weaponization of data, as and data points as people use them, you know, like another example I could always think of is sort of like people love talking about GDP, right? They'll use GDP as a measure of economic stability and health. And, you know, but then there's the joke that Elon Musk told and sort of failed in telling when he was on the Joe Rogan podcast about the two economists and they run into a poop in the woods, and you know, like, and it's they're paying each other $100 each, and you know, and they're like, wait a minute, didn't we just hand $100 back and forth between us? And the guy says, yes, but the GDP increased by $200. And so it's like, you know, and that's when I always think about sort of like mirage data, right? That is, it can tell you something, but whether or not that metric is a good measurement is not necessarily great. And so when it comes to that methodology, like what's your guys' general attitude towards just the utility of data and how it's applied? And then when approaching talking about those data points, is there a strategic and concerted effort on the part of you and NHFPI to use the data that is going to most adequately communicate the correct message to paint the right picture for people so that they're not being disillusioned by what's actually happening?
Yeah, it's a great question because we are in an environment where people do use facts to forward their own means as opposed to facts for facts' sakes. I'm a big fan of facts for the sake of facts. But I'll say generally we are very careful about the precision around which we present data and how we describe it. So I never want to present something where someone could where a reasonable person could misinterpret what we're showing, right? What we're presenting. And as a result, yes, we do make lists. We're guilty of making lists too. I'd mentioned before that New Hampshire is the second highest property taxes per capita after New Jersey in fiscal year 2022.
Right.
And I tried to be very precise there. And by the way, that's one measure. Right? One of the things that I would encourage your listeners to think about when they're seeing those lists is the broader the topic is that the list claims to cover, the more methodology has to go into it. So when I'm comfortable making a list saying, here's a specific time period and here's the total number of dollars per capita paid in property taxes, right, in a state.
Right.
Because that's a dollar figure, that's a number of people. Those are both estimates, but they're reasonably good estimates. And then it's just division. Right? We're not saying very much there in terms of there's not a complex methodology to get to that point, right? The more complex the methodology is, if you're seeing a list of best states to live in, for example, there's inherently something subjective in there because what I want in a state to live in may be very different than what my neighbor wants or what you want, Carter, or whatever it may be, right? So there's inherently judgment calls that are going to be made there. And then how are those data crunched together? And also, what are the actual differences? What certainty do we have about the differences between the states? If you're getting to this, list of like, is the difference between 1 and 2 the same as the difference between 2 and 3, or 2 and 3 basically tied, right? And they have to parse through down to the hundredths of a percentage point in their modeling, right? So
Right.
I think that the flashier, if you will, that a list gets in terms of trying to claim a lot, right? That's where I become more skeptical,
Sure.
or where I want to dig further in. I'm not always
Yeah.
inherently skeptical about it, but I want to dig further in to see. Because there are some very good organizations that put out lists like that try to get to
Sure.
those numbers, and try to get to them very honestly, and try to crunch the numbers in a way that's very transparent, and that people can, and make it accessible for folks, but still meaningful. So when we're presenting data, we try to be very careful to make sure that people have a strong and clear opportunity to understand what are those data actually saying, right? This is a number. What does this number actually mean? What is the valuable context for this number? And people use our numbers for all sorts of reasons and to accomplish all sorts of goals. I think that in aggregate, getting good information out into the public discussion is a positive thing. People are going to pick and choose sometimes which numbers they want to pay attention to, which ones they don't want to pay attention to.
Right.
I always considered a goal here at NHFPI to get the relevant numbers for people out into the ecosystem so that people can, and the relevant data and information and research, right, not just numbers, out into the ecosystem so that people can have more productive public policy discussions, and then can work from the basis of fact of, look, like we know to a lot of our conversation today, we know that property taxes are high in New Hampshire and we rely on them disproportionately to fund public services. What does that mean? How does that affect our well-being in New Hampshire? And to some of your questions earlier, like if we have a qualm with that, how do we address that, right? How do we then craft public policy in a way that either makes us less reliant on it or makes the reliance less onerous for example, people with low incomes in the state. So
Right.
there are always going to be individuals who want to use particular data points for their own purposes, right? Having the data out there and having it be correct is still a step forward beyond not having it out there at all.
Right.
And that information then leads to a more enriched public policy discussion that will, I believe, lead to a better outcome for everyone overall. At least when people are able to access that complete information. You made a point earlier about things being opaque, in the budget process and how the statewide education property tax works. Yes, the opacity is real. That's part of my job, is to try to help people unpack that. Part of what we do here at NHFPI is to make it accessible to as many people as we can, depending on whatever their starting point is. If they haven't looked at a graph since high school, or if it's their favorite thing to do, right? We want to be able to give them information that's useful for them. But yes, we're in an environment where, because information is so easily accessible, people can select particular things that they want to select. But having a set of reliable places that information can be selected from, and where that's appropriate context, that's what I know I strive for in my work here at NHFPI, is to make sure that people have comprehensive, robust, reliable information about what's going on in the economy and about what's going on with the state budget, with state revenues. We hope to be a resource for everyone in the state who we can be a resource for in that way. It's not always easy work. There's a lot that's, it's not exactly clear what's going on, and we have to figure it out too. And we have to then interpret it for folks. But the more people who know about it and the more people who can access it, the fewer barriers there are to engagement, so that people can have better tools and more tools to create the world that they want to see with public policy changes.
Awesome. Well, Bill Sletten, Research Director at New Hampshire Fiscal Policy Institute, thank you so much for coming on today. This was a real pleasure to talk to you, and I've been looking forward to this one.
So, thank you very much, Carter. It was great to be here. I really appreciate the opportunity, and thanks for devoting the time to it.
Yeah, of course. You got it. And that does it for the recording today. Hope you guys enjoyed it. I know I did. And as always, you can subscribe on Patreon, Substack, or just on the channel below. But those other two platforms, helps support the channel. So please do that if you are feeling so obliged. If you can afford a cup of coffee every month, you can afford this channel. So with that, take care, folks, and we will catch you guys next time.